She was 7 months pregnant, working a double shift, and carrying the son of a fallen Marine in a body that had been holding itself together on grief and stubbornness for 14 months. Her back ached. Her ankles were swollen inside her shoes. Around her neck, under her uniform, hung the dog tags her husband James had worn through 2 tours in Iraq, the only piece of him she had left, besides the child growing inside her. She still smiled at every single table she passed, because that was the kind of woman Clare Hartley was, and because she needed this job more than anyone in that diner could imagine. Then Gerald Staten walked through the door, and 6 bikers in the corner booth slowly stopped talking. This is the story of what happened at Cedar Ridge Diner on a Wednesday afternoon in Mill Haven, Georgia. And by the time it's over, you're going to feel something you won't forget quickly. Stay with me. This is Heart Tales. Before any of that, before Gerald Staten, before the corner booth, before everything that came after, there was 5:20 in the morning. The alarm went off in Clare Hartley's studio apartment 3 blocks from Cedar Ridge, and she opened her eyes to the same ceiling she had been staring at for 14 months. Same water stain in the corner. Same hairline crack running diagonally across the plaster like a scar that refused to heal. She lay still for a moment, one hand on her belly, 7 months along, and the baby kicked, the way he always kicked at this hour, like he already knew the shape of their days and had decided to match it. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph. Her wedding day, May 2011. She was 23 in that photo, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers James had picked himself, because he said florist flowers looked like they were trying too hard. Standing beside her in his dress, blues was Corporal James Hartley, USMC, 26 years old. Dark hair, easy smile, eyes that went serious when something mattered. He had been gone for 14 months. She touched the corner of the frame with 2 fingers, the way she did every morning. Then she sat up slowly and started the process of becoming someone who could get through another day. On the kitchen counter, beneath a stack of unopened mail, sat an eviction notice. 10 days, $1,400 in back rent. Beside it, a billing statement from the Clarkson Fertility Clinic. $8,200, outstanding balance. The baby inside her was James's son, conceived 5 months after his death through IVF, using sperm he had frozen before his second deployment. They had talked about it once, sitting on their back porch the night before he shipped out. Just in case, he had said. Hope for the best, but plan for the people you love. That was James, always thinking 3 steps ahead of the worst thing that could happen. She got dressed in the dark, Cedar Ridge uniform, black pants that barely closed anymore, white shirt stretched across her belly, shoes that had stopped being comfortable in month 5. She clasped the silver chain around her neck, the dog tags James had worn through Fallujah and Ramadi and every other place that had tried to take him before a drunk driver on Route 7 finally did. She touched them once. Then she walked the 3 blocks to work. Rose Dunbar was already inside when Claire arrived at 5:50, prepping the griddle, starting the coffee. The older woman looked up. "You're early," Rose said. "I know." Claire tied her apron. "But I'm here." Rose watched her for a moment, the shadows under her eyes, the careful way she moved, every step a small negotiation. "Claire, you don't have to work the dinner shift tonight. I can call Marcy. I need the hours." It was the same conversation they'd had 4 times that week. Rose knew about the eviction notice. She knew about the clinic bills. She knew that Claire was one unexpected expense away from losing everything. But she also knew that Clare Hartley was too proud to accept charity and too stubborn to quit. So Rose handed her the coffee pot. The morning rush came and went. Claire moved through it the way she always did, efficiently, quietly, one hand occasionally resting on her belly when she thought no one was looking. She smiled at every table. She remembered orders without writing them down. If her back ached with every step and her ankles throbbed inside her shoes, and the exhaustion pulled at her like something with weight, she never let it reach her face. That was the kind of woman Clare Hartley was. Ray Calloway stood up. He simply stood, and the 5 men behind him stood with him, and the corner booth that had been quiet all afternoon became something else entirely. Gerald Staten looked up. Ray walked toward him, the way a man walks when he has already decided what he is going to do, and has no interest in being talked out of it. Measured, unhurried, the specific pace of a man who has done this before and knows that speed is beside the point. He stopped 2 feet from Gerald's table. He looked at Gerald's hand still wrapped around Claire's wrist. Then he looked at Gerald's face. "Let go of her," Ray said. Quietly. The way you say something when you only plan to say it once. The diner went completely still. The ceiling fan turned overhead. Someone's coffee cup clinked against its saucer, and the sound carried all the way to the back wall. Gerald looked at Ray. Looked at the 5 men positioned at various points around him. Just present. The way a wall is present. He took in the leather vests, the patches, the particular quality of stillness that came off these men like heat off summer asphalt. He released Claire's wrist. "Mind your business, old man," Gerald said. He looked Ray over the way men like Gerald looked at men like Ray. The worn boots, the weathered face, the gray at the temples, and made the kind of calculation that had served him well for 20 years. 60-something. Road-worn. A biker from out of town who had no idea who he was dealing with. "You really want to do this?" Gerald said. The smile came back, easy and certain, like a man who had never lost this kind of conversation in his life. Ray looked at him for a moment without expression. Then he looked past Gerald, at the room. "4 people in this room have their phones out," he said. "You put your hands on a pregnant woman. That's already done. What happens next is up to you." Gerald looked at the room. It was true. 4 phones, held openly now. People who had stopped pretending they weren't watching. Rose Bellamy behind the counter had her own phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and steady as she gave the address to the dispatcher. Gerald stood up slowly, straightened his jacket. The performance of a man recalibrating in real time, trying to make the recalibration look like a choice he'd planned all along. He looked at Claire, who had moved to stand beside Rose, one hand pressed flat against the counter, breathing steady, eyes dry. Something in her face had changed from what it was 20 minutes ago. The careful composure was still there, but underneath it now was something harder, something that had decided to stop waiting for permission to exist. Gerald looked at Ray one more time. "This isn't over," he said, low enough that only Ray could hear. Ray held his gaze. "Yes, it is," he said. Gerald walked out of Cedar Ridge Diner with the measured step of a man who needed the exit to look deliberate. His black SUV pulled out of the lot and turned onto Birch Street without rushing. The diner exhaled. Claire stood at the counter with Rose's arm around her shoulders, watching through the window until the SUV disappeared. Her hand had found the dog tags at her chest again, fingers resting against the worn metal the way they always did when she needed something solid to hold on to. The youngest of Ray's men crossed the room first, dark-haired, maybe 30, with the kind of eyes that had been places they couldn't talk about. He stopped at a respectful distance. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Claire looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. And then, because it was true in the way that mattered most, "I'm fine." Ray came to stand nearby, present without crowding, the way you stand near someone when you want them to know they are seen. "Thank you," Claire said, looking up at him. Ray nodded once, and then his eyes moved to the dog tags at her throat, and something crossed his face. That current again. That private thing she had seen from across the room. Something old, something that had been sitting inside him for a long time, waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The police arrived 11 minutes later. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb arrived first, followed 30 seconds later by his partner, Officer Dana Croft. They walked in, took in the room, the phone still out, Rose standing behind the counter with her arms crossed, 6 bikers in the corner booth, and Webb's jaw tightened in the particular way of a man who already knew this afternoon was going to be complicated. He knew Gerald Staten. Everyone in Millhaven law enforcement knew Gerald Staten. The man had donated $40,000 to the county sheriff's department over the past 5 years. His name was on a plaque in the lobby of the precinct building on Madison Street. But there were 4 phones in this room, and whatever was on them was already out there. Webb took Claire's statement first. She gave it the way she did everything, steadily, clearly, without embellishment. What Gerald had said, what he had done, the exact words she had used when she asked him to let go. Webb wrote it all down. Croft moved to the witnesses, starting with the couple nearest the center table, who had caught the clearest angle on their phone. When Webb was done with Claire, He walked to the corner booth. "You Ray Calloway?" he asked. "Yes, sir. You and your people. You didn't touch him?" "We stood up," Ray said. "That's all." Webb looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "We'll be in touch with Mr. Staten," he said. The way he said it told Ray everything about how that conversation was likely to go. After the deputies left, the diner slowly found its breath again. Customers finished their meals. The afternoon light shifted through the east-facing windows. Rose put on a fresh pot of coffee and set a slice of peach pie on the counter in front of Claire without asking. "Eat something," Rose said. Claire looked at the pie. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry." Claire ate the pie. Ray came to stand at the counter, leaving a respectful distance. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to ask you something, if that's all right." Claire looked up at him. In the afternoon light, she could see him more clearly than she had from across the room. The weathered lines of his face, the gray at his temples, the way he held himself, still, unhurried, like a man who had learned a long time ago that most things worth doing didn't require urgency. "Go ahead," she said. Ray's eyes moved to the dog tags at her throat. "Those tags," he said. "May I ask who they belong to?" Claire's hand went to them the way it always did. She held them for a moment, feeling the worn edges under her fingers. "My husband," she said. "Corporal James Hartley, USMC, 2 tours in Iraq." She paused. "He passed away 14 months ago." Ray went very still. Behind him, the youngest of his men looked up from the booth. Rose, wiping down the counter nearby, slowed her hand. "James Hartley," Ray said. His voice had changed. Something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Claire's breath caught. "Yes." "Did you know him?" Ray was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that the question hung in the air between them and changed shape. "Ma'am," he said finally, "on November 23, 2007, outside Fallujah, my convoy hit an IED. The vehicle I was in flipped and caught fire. I was trapped inside." He stopped, steadied himself. Corporal James Hartley was on foot patrol 200 meters away. He ran into the kill zone while rounds were still coming in. He pulled me out of that vehicle. The diner had gone quiet again, a different quiet from before. Claire stared at him. "I was medevaced to Germany," Ray continued. 3 weeks in the hospital. Burns, shrapnel. By the time I was stable enough to ask about the men who got me out, James had already rotated back stateside. I lost track of him. He looked at her. "I have been trying to find James Hartley for 17 years. The words landed slowly, one at a time. Claire felt them the way you feel something arriving from a long distance. First as sound, then as meaning, then as something bigger than either. "He never told me," she whispered. "That sounds like him," Ray said. And then, quietly, "That sounds exactly like him." Claire pressed her fingers against the dog tags and felt the tears come before she could decide anything about them. She had been holding it together for 14 months, working doubles, paying what she could, carrying her son through a world that had taken his father before he had a chance to meet him. She had held it together through the funeral, through the IVF appointments, through the eviction notice on her counter, and the clinic bill that kept arriving in the mail. She had held it together that morning, when she put on her uniform and walked 3 blocks to work, and smiled at every table she passed. But sitting here now, with James's dog tags in her hand, and this man standing in front of her telling her that her husband had run into a burning kill zone 17 years ago, and saved a life, and never once mentioned it, not in 12 years of marriage, not in quiet evenings on the back porch, not in any of the conversations about the future they used to have. She cried. She cried the way you cry when something true finally reaches you after a very long journey. One hand on the counter, one hand on her belly, Rose's arm around her shoulders, Ray standing nearby, not filling the silence with anything, just letting it be what it needed to be. In the corner booth, 5 men sat without speaking. Each of them had known Ray Calloway long enough to understand what they were witnessing. This was not a stranger in a diner. This was the end of something Ray had been carrying alone for 17 years. A debt that had survived a war, and a decade and a half, and a wrong turn on Route 7, and found its way back to a Wednesday afternoon in Millhaven, Georgia. Some people call that coincidence. Ray Calloway did not believe in coincidence. He believed in debts. and he believed that some debts do not expire just because the person you owe them to is no longer there to collect. James Hartley had taught her the signal 3 weeks before his second deployment. It was a Sunday evening in October 2006. They were sitting on the back steps of their rental house on Elm Street in Savannah, Georgia, the one with the broken screen door they kept meaning to fix. The sun was going down. James had a beer he wasn't really drinking. Claire could tell by the way he was holding it, loosely, like something he'd picked up and forgotten about, that he had something on his mind. She waited. That was one of the things she had learned about James in 4 years together. He got to things in his own time, and rushing him only made him go quieter. "I want to show you something," he said finally. He took her hand, turned it palm up, then he pressed her index finger against the inside of his own wrist, right over the pulse point, and held it there for 3 seconds. "What is that?" she asked. "It's a signal," he said. "Something the guys use sometimes. When you're in a situation where you can't speak, where calling out would make things worse." He paused. "You find something metal, something you're already carrying. You press one finger against it, like that, and you look at whoever you trust in the room." Claire looked at him. "James, it doesn't mean anything is going to happen," he said. "It just means that if it does, if you're ever somewhere and something feels wrong and you can't say it out loud, I want you to know how to ask for help without asking." She had wanted to tell him he was being paranoid. She had wanted to tell him that she lived in Savannah, that she worked at a diner, that the most dangerous thing she encountered most days was the lunch rush on Fridays. But she looked at his face, at the serious set of his jaw, and the way his eyes were watching her with that particular intensity he reserved for the things that mattered most. And she understood that this was not about Savannah. This was about the fact that in 3 weeks he was getting on a plane and going somewhere she couldn't follow. And this was the only thing he could think to give her before he left. So she learned it. She pressed her index finger against the metal of his dog tags. He was wearing them already, had started wearing them to bed since the deployment orders came through, and held it there. 3 seconds. Eyes up. "Good," he said. "I hope I never have to use it," she said. James looked at her, took her hand and held it properly this time. Fingers laced through hers. "Me too," he said. "But now you know how." She had thought about that evening many times over the years. When James came back from his second tour, when they got married, when he went back for a third and came home again, when they bought the little house outside Nashville and started talking about the future, in the careful, hopeful way of people who have learned not to take it for granted. She thought about it, and it always felt like a relic, something that belonged to a version of their life that fear had built and love had outgrown. She had never used it. 12 years, and she had carried it the way you carry something you hope to forget. Until today. And sitting at the counter of Cedar Ridge Diner with a slice of peach pie going cold in front of her, and Ray Calloway's words still moving through her like something she hadn't finished processing yet, Claire thought about James teaching her that signal on the back steps in Savannah. The way the last light had caught the silver of his dog tags. The way he had taken her hand afterward and held it like something worth keeping. He had known, somehow. In the way that James always seemed to know the things that mattered before they arrived. He had given her a way to ask for help without asking. And 17 years later, the man whose life he had saved had been sitting in the corner booth when she needed it most. Claire looked down at the dog tags in her hand. The metal was warm from her skin. On the back of the first tag, worn almost smooth now, she could still feel the raised letters of his name under her fingertip. J. Hartley, traced so many times in 14 months of dark mornings that she could read them without looking. She pressed her index finger against them. Once, the way he had taught her on the back steps in Savannah, the way she had practiced and never used, and had stopped believing she would ever need. Then she looked up at Ray Calloway, and for the first time since James died, something shifted inside her chest. Something that had been locked down for 14 months, held tight by the sheer effort of keeping everything together. She felt it loosen. She felt him. Close. Present. Like a man who had planned 3 steps ahead of the worst thing that could happen, and had somehow managed to reach across 14 months, and 17 years, and a burning Humvee outside Fallujah to make sure she was going to be all right. By the time Gerald Staton's black SUV reached the end of Birch Street, he was already on the phone. Ray understood that about him. Sitting in the parking lot of the Red Oak Motel on the edge of Millhaven that evening, while his men checked in, and the Georgia sky went dark overhead. Men like Gerald went home and made calls. They pulled on strings they had spent years cultivating. They turned a bad afternoon into a problem to be managed. The call Gerald had made before he was even out of the parking lot was the tell. Ray had watched enough of these situations to recognize the move. He sat on his bike and thought about Clare Hartley walking 3 blocks to that diner in the dark every morning. About the eviction notice she hadn't mentioned but that Rose had told him about quietly before they left. Pressing a folded piece of paper into his hand with Claire's address, and the words she couldn't say out loud in front of Claire herself. About the IVF clinic bill and the dog tags, and the way Claire had touched the frame of James's photograph. He thought about James Hartley running 200 meters across open ground, with rounds coming in. Ray made 2 calls that night. The first was to his chapter's lawyer in Nashville. The second was to a man named Curtis Webb, no relation to the deputy, who ran a veterans advocacy organization out of Chattanooga and had spent 15 years untangling exactly the kind of shell company ownership structures that Gerald Staten used to hide what he owned and who he was squeezing. By 9 o'clock that evening, Curtis had already pulled the LLC filings. Gerald Staten owned 14 properties in Millhaven County. He had been running what Curtis described, carefully and in the specific language of a man who had testified in 3 federal cases, as a systematic pressure campaign against tenants he identified as vulnerable. Single women, elderly residents, people with medical debt, people whose circumstances made them unlikely to push back. The Birch Street complex where Claire lived had seen 6 evictions in the past 18 months. 4 of them women, 3 of them with children. Ray read the summary Curtis sent him and sat with it for a while. Then he walked to the room where his men were gathered and told them what he had found. Nobody said anything for a moment. Dalton, the youngest, the one who had crossed the room first that afternoon, was sitting on the edge of the bed with his forearms on his knees. He had been quiet since they left the diner. "We staying?" he asked. Ray looked at him. "We're staying." That was the entirety of the discussion. The next morning, Claire arrived at Cedar Ridge at 5:50 to find Ray Calloway and 2 of his men already sitting in the corner booth with coffee. She stopped just inside the door. Ray looked up. "Morning," he said. Claire looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the booth and stood at the edge of it. "You don't have to do this," she said. Ray looked at her. "We know." She looked at him, at the steadiness in his face, the complete absence of performance in it, the way he said "we know," the same way he had said, "Yes, it is the day before." Like a man who had already finished the argument with himself and moved on. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went and got the coffee pot. At 8:17 that morning, a white sedan pulled into the parking lot, and 2 men in suits walked into Cedar Ridge Diner. They introduced themselves to Rose as representatives of Staten Property Management, there to conduct a routine health and safety inspection of the premises. Rose looked at them. Then she looked at the corner booth. Ray was already watching. "The last inspection was 14 months ago," Rose said pleasantly. "We passed with no violations. I'll need to see your credentials and the inspection order." The 2 men exchanged a glance. One of them produced a business card. Rose examined it, set it on the counter, and picked up her phone. "I'm going to call the county inspector's office to confirm this is a scheduled visit," she said. "You're welcome to wait." They waited 4 minutes. Then they left. At 10:45, Claire received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She stepped into the back room to take it. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and delivered a message that took approximately 90 seconds. Her lease was being reviewed for non-renewal. The Birch Street property was undergoing renovation. Residents whose accounts were not current would not be offered renewal terms. She stood in the back room for a moment after the call ended. Then she walked back out to the floor, refilled a table's coffee, smiled at the family by the window, and went back to work. Ray watched her come out of the back room. He had not heard the call. But he had seen the look on her face when she came through the door, that specific composure, the one that cost something, and he understood what it meant. He pulled out his phone and texted Curtis 3 words. "It's escalating. Go." By noon, Curtis Webb had filed a formal complaint with the Georgia Department of Community Affairs. By 2 o'clock, a journalist at the Millhaven Gazette who had been trying to report on Staten Property Management for 8 months, and who had been quietly warned off twice by people she couldn't name, received an anonymous package with 14 months of LLC filings, tenant complaint records, and 4 videos from the Cedar Ridge Diner incident, each from a different angle. Gerald Staten's afternoon was about to get very complicated. He just didn't know it yet. The Millhaven Gazette ran the story on Thursday morning. It was not a small story. It ran above the fold on the front page with a headline that said, "Local developer faces allegations of systematic tenant harassment." Below it, 4 screenshots from the Cedar Ridge Diner videos, and a sidebar with a breakdown of the LLC structure that connected Gerald Staten to 14 properties across the county. The reporter's name was Beth Carver. She had been working on Gerald Staten for 8 months. She had 2 sources who had gone quiet under pressure, and a third who had agreed to talk only if she could corroborate everything independently. The package Curtis Webb sent her had given her everything she needed. By 7 that morning, the story had been shared 400 times on Facebook. By 9, a local news station out of Atlanta had picked it up. By 11, Gerald Staten's office phone had stopped being answered. Gerald himself called his lawyer at 6:53 in the morning. The conversation lasted 41 minutes. When it was over, Gerald sat in his kitchen, in the kind of silence that comes when a man is doing the math and not liking the result. He had spent 20 years building something in Millhaven, carefully, methodically, LLC by LLC, property by property, relationship by relationship. He had donated to the right causes, attended the right events, put his name on the right buildings. He had cultivated the kind of civic presence that made people uncomfortable asking certain questions, because asking those questions felt like ingratitude. It had taken one Wednesday afternoon to unravel it, 1 pregnant waitress and 6 bikers in a corner booth. His lawyer's advice had been clear. Get ahead of it. Issue a statement. Express regret. Cooperate with the Housing Authority inquiry. Do not contact Clare Hartley, Rose Bellamy, or any of the bikers directly or indirectly. Do not send anyone to that diner again. Gerald issued the statement at 10 o'clock. It was 3 paragraphs long and used the word regrettable 4 times, without once using the word sorry. The internet noticed. By noon, the comments under the Gazette story had 340 replies. Veterans groups had shared the diner video in 11 states. A nonprofit that tracked predatory housing practices in the Southeast had tagged the story in a post that reached 40,000 people by the end of the day. 2 of Gerald's former tenants, women he had pressured out of the Birch Street complex the previous year, had given interviews to Beth Carver for a follow-up piece already in progress. At Cedar Ridge Diner, the lunch crowd was the largest Rose could remember on a Thursday. People who had not been in for months came in and sat down and ordered things and left tips that were too large. A woman Claire had never met came in at 11:30, sat at the counter, and said quietly that she had lived in the Birch Street complex 2 years ago and that she was glad someone had finally said something out loud. Claire listened to her, refilled her coffee, said, "I'm glad you're okay." Ray and his men were at the corner booth. They had been there since 5:50. At 2:15, Gerald Staten's black SUV pulled into the Cedar Ridge parking lot. Rose saw it first. She straightened behind the counter and said nothing, just looked at the corner booth. Ray was already looking at the door. Gerald came in alone this time. His suit was still pressed, but something in how he wore it had changed. The ease was gone, replaced by the controlled bearing of a man performing a composure he no longer fully possessed. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. Every conversation in the diner stopped with him. He looked at Claire. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. Claire set down the coffee pot. She looked at Gerald Staten, the way a woman looks at something she has finished being afraid of. "You can speak," she said. "I'm listening." Gerald glanced at Ray. Ray was sitting with his coffee, watching, his face giving nothing away. "What happened yesterday was—" Gerald stopped, started again. "I want to discuss a resolution. Regarding the Birch Street property. Your account." "My account," Claire said. "The back rent. I'm prepared to consider the balance settled, given the circumstances." The diner was very quiet. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Gerald shifted his weight slightly. The first crack in the performance. "Mr. Staten," Claire said, "I'm going to pay my rent. Every dollar I owe. Because it's mine to pay and I don't want anything from you." She paused. "But there are 6 women who used to live in that building who weren't given the choice. And 2 of them are talking to a reporter right now." Gerald's jaw tightened. "This conversation is done," Claire said. She picked up the coffee pot and walked to the next table. Gerald stood in the center of Cedar Ridge Diner for 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which the room watched him, and he understood, perhaps for the first time in 20 years, what it felt like to be in a space where his presence changed nothing in his favor. He left. Ray watched him go. Then he looked at Claire, moving between tables with the coffee pot, smiling at the family by the window, her back straight and her hands steady. He thought about James Hartley running 200 meters across open ground with rounds still coming in. He thought about Clare Hartley picking up her coffee pot and walking to the next table 4 seconds after telling a man she was done with him. He thought about the way both of them moved through the things that could have stopped them, quietly, completely, without making a production of it. The apple doesn't fall far, he thought. 3 days later, the Georgia Department of Community Affairs opened a formal investigation into Staten property management. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb, facing a recorder held by Beth Carver on the steps of the precinct, confirmed that the department was reviewing the incident at Cedar Ridge Diner, and that charges were being considered. Gerald Staten's lawyer released a second statement. This one used the word sorry once, near the end, in a sentence that also contained the phrase, without prejudice. The internet noticed that too. The charge came 6 weeks later. Misdemeanor battery, criminal harassment, violation of Georgia's fair housing statutes across 7 properties. Gerald Staten's lawyer had spent those 6 weeks trying to negotiate the battery charge down to a civil matter. He had not succeeded. The videos were too clear. The witnesses were too many. And Beth Carver had published 3 more stories in the Gazette, each one adding another layer to the picture of what Gerald Staten had been doing in Millhaven County for the better part of 2 decades. The arraignment was on a Tuesday morning in October. Gerald arrived in a different suit than the one he had worn to Cedar Ridge Diner, charcoal gray instead of navy, as if the color change might help. His lawyer walked beside him. 2 of his former business associates, men who had attended his fundraisers and accepted his donations, and quietly benefited from his connections for years, were conspicuously absent. The courtroom was not full, but Beth Carver was there, in the 3rd row, with her recorder and her notebook, and in the back row, so still they were easy to overlook, sat Ray Calloway and Dalton Mercer. Gerald did not see them until he turned to take his seat. He looked at Ray for a moment. Ray looked back at him with the same expression he had worn in the diner. Calm, present, giving nothing away. Gerald turned back around. The judge read the charges. Gerald entered a plea of not guilty. A trial date was set for February. The whole thing took 22 minutes. Outside on the courthouse steps, Gerald stood with his lawyer, while the lawyer explained the next steps in the measured tone of a man who had delivered this speech many times before. Gerald listened. He nodded at the appropriate moments. He said the right things. And then his lawyer walked away to get the car, and Gerald stood alone on the steps of the Millhaven County Courthouse for 30 seconds. And something happened in those 30 seconds that Gerald Staten would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked. He thought about Clare Hartley, 7 months pregnant, working a double shift, smiling at every table she passed. He had seen her that afternoon and made a calculation, the kind he had been making his entire adult life, the one that sorted people into categories based on their leverage and their options and their likelihood of pushing back. She had scored low on all 3 counts. That was how he had always operated. Find the people who can't say no and make sure they understand their situation. He had never stopped to think about what it cost them. Standing on the courthouse steps with the Georgia sun going flat and cold, Gerald thought about Claire paying her bills alone and raising a dead man's son alone and walking 3 blocks to work in the dark every morning because she needed the hours. He thought about the 6 women he had pushed out of the Birch Street complex. He thought about the tenant complaint records, the ones that contained, in the flat bureaucratic language of official complaints, the actual texture of what his management company had put those women through. He had known, of course. He had always known. But knowing and understanding are different things. He had spent 20 years using people's vulnerability as a tool, and he had never once considered that the people on the other end of that tool were carrying something real. It was not a comfortable thing to understand. Standing there on those steps, Gerald Staten felt the specific weight of a man who had run the numbers his entire life, and was only now, at 54 years old, understanding that some of the numbers had been people. He walked to the car. While Gerald Staten was working through his legal strategy, Ray Calloway was working through something else entirely. The VA survivors benefits process had been Claire's biggest untouched resource. James had served 12 years. His death qualified Claire and their unborn child for dependency and indemnity compensation, a monthly benefit she had been entitled to for 14 months and had never applied for because the paperwork was 47 pages long, and she had been too exhausted and too grief-struck to navigate it alone. Curtis Webb sat with her at her kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon and walked her through every page. It took 3 hours. Claire asked precise questions and wrote down every answer in a small notebook she kept on the counter next to the clinic bill. The application was submitted on a Monday. The preliminary approval came back in 11 days. The monthly benefit, retroactive to the date of James's death, covered 14 months of back payments in a single deposit that arrived in Claire's account on a Thursday morning. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the number on her phone screen for a long time. Then she called Rose. "I need to come in late today," she said. "I have some bills to pay." She paid the back rent first, the full $1,400, in person, at the Staten Property Management Office, now operating under court-appointed oversight. Then she paid the Clarkson Fertility Clinic, the full $8,200. She kept the receipt from the clinic in the same drawer where she kept James's photograph. The Iron Riders came back to Millhaven one more time before the baby arrived. All 6 of them, a Saturday morning in November, 6 bikes on the interstate as the Tennessee hills gave way to the Georgia flatlands. Dalton had organized it with the spreadsheet precision of a former Army logistics man. Rose had been cooking since 6. There were people Claire hadn't expected. Women from the Veterans Advocacy Network, a social worker from Millhaven Family Services, 4 of her regular customers who had become something closer to friends over 14 months of early morning shifts. Ray sat at the corner booth, the same one. Claire came and sat across from him, 7.5 months along, moving more carefully than she had in August. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. Ray looked at her. "James pulled me out of a burning vehicle," he said. "I've been trying to figure out what that's worth for 17 years. He paused. "Turns out it's worth showing up." Claire looked down at her coffee. "He would have liked you," she said. "I know," Ray said. "I would have liked him too." James Ray Hartley was born on December 9th at 6:22 in the morning at Millhaven County General Hospital. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair, his father's jaw. Rose was in the waiting room. Dalton drove Claire to the hospital and stayed until the nurses made him sit down. Ray got the call at 6:45 and said 3 words into the phone before his voice gave out. He sat in his kitchen in Nashville for a while after that, holding the phone, thinking about a dirt road outside Fallujah on a November morning 17 years ago and a young corporal who had run toward a burning vehicle when every reasonable instinct said to go the other way. James Hartley had made a choice that day, a simple one, in the way that only the most important choices are simple. Not easy, not without cost, but clear. Someone needed help. He was the one standing close enough to provide it. Ray thought about that choice every day. He suspected he always would. He got up, put on his jacket, and went out to his bike. He had a long drive to make, and a boy to meet. The plaque went up on a Saturday in March. Bronze, 8 inches by 12, mounted on the wall beside the corner booth at Cedar Ridge Diner. Rose had commissioned it through a veterans memorial shop in Atlanta. It read, "In memory of Corporal James Bennett Hartley, USMMC. Husband, father, Marine." He ran toward the fire so others could walk away. This booth is his. Ray had seen the design before it was cast. He had asked Rose if he could add 1 line at the bottom. Rose had said yes without asking what the line was. The line read, "Some debts don't expire." The morning the plaque went up, Cedar Ridge was closed to regular customers. Rose had made breakfast for the people who mattered. Claire and James Ray, 4 months old now and asleep in a carrier against her chest, his dark hair sticking up in the particular way it had since the day he was born. Ray and his 5 brothers, Curtis Webb, who had driven up from Chattanooga, Beth Carver, who had covered the story from the beginning and had become, in the way these things sometimes happen, something closer to a friend than a journalist, and 2 of the women from the Birch Street complex, the ones who had talked to Beth Carver, whose names had appeared in the housing authority filings, who had each lost something to Gerald Staten's math, and who were each, slowly, rebuilding. Rose made scrambled eggs and biscuits, and the peach pie she was known for. Everyone ate. The baby woke up and looked around the room with the serious, evaluating expression of a 4-month-old encountering a large number of strangers, and then decided, apparently, that the strangers were acceptable, because he went back to sleep. Ray stood in front of the plaque for a long time after it went up. He touched the edge of it once, lightly, the way you touch something you want to make sure is real. "Thank you," he said. To Rose, technically, but not really to Rose. At the christening 2 weeks later, Ray Calloway stood at the front of a small church in Millhaven, Georgia, and became James Ray Hartley's godfather. The baby slept through most of the ceremony. Claire cried, which she had given herself permission to do, and Rose cried, which she pretended not to, and Dalton, sitting in the third pew with the rest of the Iron Riders, looked at the ceiling for a while, in the specific way of a man managing his composure in a church. Afterward, in the church parking lot, Claire stood with Ray while the baby drowsed against her shoulder. "I've been thinking about something," she said. Ray waited. "James never told me about Fallujah," she said. 12 years. He never said a word." She paused. "I used to think that was modesty. Now I think it was something else." "What do you think it was?" Ray asked. Claire was quiet for a moment. "I think for him it was just what you do," she said. "When someone needs help and you're the one standing close enough." He never talked about it, because in his mind there was nothing to talk about. Ray looked at her, at the baby against her shoulder, at the dog tags still around her neck, the ones she had never taken off, that James had worn through Fallujah and Ramadi and every other place, that she had pressed her finger against in a diner on a Wednesday afternoon, and sent a signal into a room full of people who weren't watching. "Yeah," Ray said. "That sounds right." Gerald Staten pleaded guilty in February to 2 counts of criminal harassment and 1 count of misdemeanor battery. His lawyer had negotiated the fair housing violations into a separate civil settlement, $430,000 distributed among the tenants his company had systematically pressured over 7 years. He received a suspended sentence, 2 years of probation, and a fine. He sold his Millhaven properties 6 months later, all 14 of them. He moved to Savannah, started over. Whether he became a different kind of man, or just a more careful version of the same one, only the people around him in the years that followed would be able to say. But on a Tuesday morning in February, before his lawyer stood up to enter the plea, Gerald Staten sat in the defendant's chair and looked across the courtroom at Clare Hartley sitting in the gallery with her son asleep, in a carrier against her chest, and he felt the specific weight of understanding something too late. He had built everything he had by finding people who couldn't fight back. He had never considered that some of them would find someone who could. There is a thing that happens sometimes, in the space between what we intend and what we do, where the real measure of a person lives. It lives in the small choices, the ones that go unrecorded, unshared, unremembered by anyone, except the people who needed them. The choice to stand up, when everyone else is looking at their plate. The choice to run toward something, when every reasonable instinct says the other direction is safer. The choice to press one finger against a piece of worn metal, and look across a room, and ask for help. James Hartley spent his life making those choices so quietly that the people around him barely knew they were being made. Clare Hartley raised his son in a studio apartment 3 blocks from the diner where her life changed, in a town that turned out to be kinder than it looked on a Wednesday in August. James Ray grew up knowing his father's name, his father's face, and the story of what his father had done on a November morning outside Fallujah, not because it made James a hero, but because it made him a man worth knowing. Ray Calloway came back to Millhaven every year. He sat in the corner booth beside the bronze plaque and drank his coffee and watched the room the way he always had. Sometimes Dalton came with him, sometimes the others, sometimes he came alone. The booth still had his name on it, in a way. The name that mattered. Some debts don't expire. If this story stayed with you, if it gave you something you'll carry for a while, share it with someone who needs it. That's all stories ever ask of us. This has been Heart Tales. We'll see you next time.